What do you make of the effort to extirpate pro-Palestinian sentiment being expressed on college campuses under the rubric of fighting anti-Semitism?
Yeah, it's funny, Glenn. There are a whole bunch of people, I won't mention them by name, who I remember used to talk a lot about how the point at university is to be made uncomfortable. That's a good thing. They didn't like safe spaces. They didn't like snowflakes. They were robust and passionate defenders of free speech, even for ideas that they considered and other people might legitimately consider deeply offensive. And they attacked the left for violating those principles. And I think they had a point. I think they were right. And some of those people were prominent Jewish figures. And now, where are those folks? Now, in the name of protecting the safety of Jewish students, basically, it's become much, much more difficult to protest on a university campus. People are getting fired right and left. Students are getting suspended and expelled because they're chanting slogans that you don't like or that you consider offensive. Well, you know what? The Palestinians feel that the pro-Israel slogans are offensive. They should still be allowed to chant them, right? And this has become part of this larger effort by the administration to basically attack these universities. It's profoundly, profoundly hypocritical. Jewish students have the right to be safe from violence and intimidation and harassment. They do not have the right to be protected from speech about Israel that makes them really uncomfortable. Being made intellectually and uncomfortable is good at a university. Just like a kid who comes from a deeply anti-abortion, anti-LGBT background and finds it uncomfortable at Brown because they meet a lot of people with a different view. That's education. A lot of these Jewish, and so it's the same thing for a Jewish kid who comes from a very Zionist environment. But the organized American Jewish community, with the backing of the politicians and these donors, instead of actually recognizing that there's a real debate that should be having, these kids are going to need to have and to listen because they could learn something, right? Instead, their response is to repress this speech and activism. And I think you would know better than, probably better than me, but I think it's really harming America's universities.
Yeah, I think it is too. And I find it quite ironic because many of the activist students who are protesting on behalf of Palestinian rights are themselves Jewish.
Right. But this is the key point, Glenn, because when you do this move that the Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish leaders do, which is you define being Jewish as being Zionist or being pro-Israel, the flip side of that is that if you're not pro-Israel or you're not Zionist, you're not actually a Jew, right? And so they don't say this out loud, but this is actually the way they function. So when Columbia University suspended Jewish Voice for Peace, right, the first word in that organization's name is Jewish, right? Anti-Defamation League congratulated the president for keeping Jewish students safe, right? So essentially what they're saying is that these Jewish students cease being Jewish because the definition of Jewish is your subscription to an ethno-nationalist project, not actually whether you're not any other more conventional definition of being Jewish. And therefore, for the truth, if you look at Germany, which has these very draconian rules about what they call anti-Semitism, the group of people that suffer the most from this are Palestinians. But the second group is Jews. Of the people who have been canceled or disciplined in Germany for anti-Semitic offenses, I think like 25% of those people have been Jews, even though Jews are like 1% of the population in Germany. Right. So this is the irony, right? Is that the dissenting Jews also end up getting repressed and sometimes even beaten up, for example, because I was, at Dartmouth, when they called the police on campus, which the American Jewish organizations applauded, the police roughed up the former head of the Jewish Studies program. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And that's keeping Jewish people safe. Well, not that, middle-aged Jewish woman who got thrown to the ground by the New Hampshire police didn't keep her safe.
But you don't think that, you do think, contrary to what I hear from Jewish advocacy organizations, that anti-Semitism is not on the rise, not only in the United States, but around the world. And they cite chapter and verse.
Well, look, there's a methodological problem, which is that the Anti-Defamation League, which is where people are relying on their data, is a pro-Israel advocacy organization, which is coding as anti-Semitism chants like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." They're considering that an episode of anti-Semitism. If you look, you're a social scientist, if you look at the social scientists who work on this, and there's particularly a guy at Tufts named Eitan Hirsch, works with a person at Harvard named Laura Roden, they actually find that anti-Semitism is far, far higher on the right. and that anti-Semitism generally tends to travel alongside other bigotries, that the people who don't like Jews tend to not like Muslims and immigrants and Black people and LGBT people. And I think anti-Semitism is on the rise, but the biggest reason it's on the rise is it's part of what comes along with this global ethno-nationalist authoritarian assault on liberal democracy, right? There is anti-Semitism on the left too. It's not as great. In fact, there was a study by the University of Chicago which found that although anti-Zionist sentiment among college students is far higher than it is among Americans as a whole, anti-Semitic attitudes are significantly lower, right? Defined it as traditional ways, like are you hostile to Jews as Jews, right? And so I think that the discourse that there's an equal amount of anti-Semitism on the left and the right is wrong. There is some conflation of Jews and Israel on the left, which is a problem, and there's sometimes use of traditional anti-Semitic kind of language, like the Jews control the media or that kind of thing. And there's sometimes a dehumanization of Israelis as just colonizers, and those are problems, but they're really much smaller problems than the problem of the kind of ethno-nationalist right that you're seeing rising in the US and Europe.